thank you guys all for being here today. My name's Mackenzie Martin Waldron. I'm on the disaster recovery team. So not on the CV team, but kind of the sister team to the new funding sources that the department is navigating. Also subject to duplication of benefits. So we're working together to learn the requirements and work with subrecipients. Just for your awareness, we are recording this training to make it available to anyone who is unable to attend today's training. So just wanted to let you know that it is being recorded. If we could hop to the next slide. So just as a heads up, you or the primary contact on your grant should have received an email about today's webinar. As we'll discuss today, we're required to have procedures in place to prevent duplication of benefits. You guys already went through the special conditions process as part of the CV agreement with DED and completed several forms, including the affidavit, the certification, the subrogation agreement. Additionally, as described in the subrecipient agreement, we need to have documentation in place to ensure that there's no duplication of benefits and that we maintain adequate written policies and procedures. And as outlined in the email that you should have received and that we'll go over in today's presentation, DED will be requesting the submission of those DOB policies and procedures for DED's review to ensure that they contain our minimum requirements. As part of that email that went out, there was a template associated with that. We'll get into that a little bit more in today's training as well. And to that end, today we're going to talk about the DOB process, details on the specific program, specific procedures for duplication of benefits, the template, and then discuss any questions that you have. If you have any questions, please do submit them in the chat box. We'll take a break part of the way through the presentation to check on any questions. And then again, at the end, after we go through the template, if the question is more easily asked verbally, please drop a note in the chat to that end and we'll unmute you so you can ask the question verbally. And then just a quick agenda for today's meeting. We're just going to go over a brief overview of the duplication of benefits policies and procedures for the CV program and discuss the process for completing the PMP template document at the subrecipient level. First, we'll kind of look at those important terms that are going to be referenced throughout the presentation and then in that template. Then we'll discuss what constitutes a duplication of benefit and how to prevent it, as well as how checks are conducted and calculated. And then finally, we'll talk about the submission of the subrecipient duplication of benefits policy and procedure. And then we'll wrap up with any questions. Just on the intro side of who's all here and who's on the CV team. As you guys know, Steve's the head of our CDBG CV program manager, as well as the head of the regular CDBG program. And then the CV team is composed of Rebecca Shademan, Tom Stevens, Laura Hart, and Andrew Moffett. And today we're joined by Laura Manafo and Allison Longo from Haggerty Consulting. They are our technical assistance provider with respect to duplication of benefits. They're helping us out to make sure we're meeting all of the necessary federal requirements, and they'll help us out by walking through some of those requirements here today with us. And just a quick background on where we're at with the CARES Act and the CV program. As you guys know, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act from 2020 provided the direct assistance for American workers, families, small businesses, and industries. And Nebraska was awarded over $14 million to that end. And we've established 3 programs where assistance can be sought. And that was through the Economic Development Program, the Coronavirus Emergency Related Payments Program, and the Emergent Threat Program. And now I'm going to turn it over to Haggerty to kind of walk through where we're at with respect to the important terms that come into play with duplication of benefits.
Sure, thanks, Mackenzie. This is Laura with Haggerty. As part of the start of the presentation, we do recognize that maybe all the participants may not be entirely familiar with duplication of benefits. So for the purposes of the presentation and the walkthrough of the template, we wanted just to touch on some brief points here in brief terms, just noting again what duplication of benefits is, and you'll see it throughout the presentation as noted in the acronym DOB, and that occurs when a beneficiary receives assistance from multiple sources of funding and the total assistance amount exceeds the need for the particular recovery purpose. So again, this is if you have a program under the CV, and the beneficiary is receiving multiple funding sources, multiple funding from funding from multiple sources, excuse me, there would have to be a duplication review. But again, DOB funds is the money received for the purposes of for that is what has already been reimbursed or paid for by another source. And so by determining that, you conduct a DOB review, and that's the process of analyzing all recovery assistance received by a beneficiary to ensure that the recipients and subrecipients do not provide funds that duplicate other assistance. And lastly, in some of the programs, they'll be subject to subrogation, which is the process by which duplicative assistance paid to the beneficiary after receiving an award are remitted to the program to rectify any of the duplication of benefits that has been identified. And then continued with some of the other terminology that you'll see throughout the presentation and the template that we will walk through is total assistance, and that includes resources received, all resources received, such as cash awards, insurance, proceeds, grants, loans, all from multiple entities, including local, state, government, non-for-profit, and private organizations as well. That all goes into the review for duplication. So it's incumbent on the subrecipients and the beneficiaries to certainly present that information at the time of the DOB checks and the reviews. Then there's the total need, which includes, again, all the necessary activities as it relates to the Economic Development and Emergency Threat Program and the coronavirus related emergency payments program household, and it's determined without regard to program specific grants. And last, unmet need is when is a total need for the eligible activities is more than the total assistance for the same purposes. So if you have a need for $100,000, you only receive $50,000, your unmet need is $50,000. So and we'll walk through some examples of that further in the presentation. As a result of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, the CARES Act was enacted by Treasury. And so this is just noting for all those that are on the line today, the two areas, the two statutory requirements, which is the Stafford Act, which again was set up prior to COVID, but for all federal agencies administering assistance for emergency response and long-term recovery, the Stafford Act, specifically the DOB provisions do apply. And then on top of that, as noted, the Treasury did enact the CARES Act, which does reference the Stafford Act, but in addition, there's some additional guidance that should be noted and is available through the CARES Act FAQs, but ultimately the DOB process and procedure that we have seen for disaster recovery in general is certainly applying to the CARES Act and coronavirus funding. And so although this does state CDBG CV duplication of benefits, we felt that it was a good, we felt it's good to share with the subrecipients and those on the call what the state of Nebraska, whom is the grantee of the CDBG CV funding, must meet, and what their minimum requirements are, which are outlined in this slide. To better understand the need for the subrecipient participation in the DOB process, we think it's, again, beneficial for all of those to understand what the grantee is responsible for per DOB, which ultimately may trigger items at the subrecipient and beneficiary level. And just to touch on some of the points here, at minimum, the grantee's policies and procedures must include a requirement that any person or entity receiving CV assistance must agree to repay any assistance that is determined to be duplication of benefit. And also the method of assessing whether the use of CV funds will duplicate financial assistance that is already received or is likely to be received by acting responsibly to evaluate the need and the resources available to meet that need. So a lot of words there, but ultimately the state is responsible for the distribution of these funds, and the subrecipient agreement, which Alice, my colleague, will talk about later on, further down in the presentation. There are requirements of the subrecipient to help the state meet their the DOB check as it relates to the CV funding source. And so how should DED and a subrecipient determine a duplication of benefits? Both entities will work to identify all assistance that can be used for the same purposes as the CV funds. And so, and why I asked that question and provide that guidance is the state, along with the subrecipients, must prepare procedures that do address the review and the review process and the procedures if there were any need for capture of funding. And so how does DED and the subrecipient prevent DOB? Both entities will work to prevent the duplication of benefits by having awareness of the unmet needs, collecting documentation such as insurance, FEMA funding, and other related assistance, and conducting ongoing discussions between DED and subrecipients, and then of course subrecipients and the beneficiaries that may have received other funding as a result of COVID-19. And then, of course, DED will continue to provide TA technical assistance to subrecipients at the request of the subrecipients. And again, both the DED and the subrecipients are responsible for incorporating procedures for addressing the review and the potential for recapture with respect to the duplication of benefits and CV funding. And so the what you see here on the slide again is the minimum procedures that we have identified, the state has identified, and you'll see some overlap within the template that the state will be asking all of you on the line to complete and submit. So we'll further talk about that down the slides. And so when conducting a DOB check, certainly you want to look for the potential other funding sources that potentially have overlap with scope or assistance. And so in areas that we've seen thus far as disaster relief funds, public assistance funds under FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Of course, the U.S. Treasury Coronavirus Relief Fund, and that was prior to CARES, the American Rescue Plan, as well, distributed dollars, any locally committed funding, any insurance provided to the beneficiary and or non-for-profit assistance. So all of these are just some examples of the potential for duplication. So we do encourage all subrecipients to communicate with the beneficiaries and as part of the policies and procedures that you either have or will be building out. This is just a piece of these are just a few examples of some funding sources that they could have received that might duplicate assistance that the state is providing under their programs. And then going into calculating duplication of benefits, for the CV program, the assistance is calculated at a point in time and is subsequently adjusted when needed. And so under the actual difference between DOB in a what we can call a normal disaster is there will be multiple DOB checks, and that can start at the forefront, that can start at the front of the program, and at different stages of the program itself. However, with CV dollars, the DOB check is required. One DOB check is required and has been shared with us that obviously at the end of the program, getting a final set of numbers on what assistance has been received seems to be a nice time to also evaluate any duplication of benefits. So it's at the discretion of DED. So we do have some programs that have initiated the DOB review currently, and then there might be the request to conduct a DOB review at the closeout of that particular project. So if after the assistance has been calculated and or an award has been made and the subgrantee or beneficiary demonstrates a change, which is what I was noting to previously in the circumstances and the award calculation should be reevaluated by the subrecipient and by ultimately DED. So again, as noted, the goal is to make sure that one, if there are any changes in assistance from other funding sources, that the beneficiary should be notifying the subrecipient as soon as possible. And then obviously the subrecipient should further that information up to DED. So DED can work with the subrecipient to determine when is the best time to do a full review and evaluation to make sure that there's no duplication. In addition to assistance received, the award again, of course, would be modified if the subrecipients or beneficiaries knowingly do not disclose all provided assistance. The award can be rescinded. So again, it's just stress the need to communicate with the beneficiaries of the programs and of the projects. So the subrecipients are kept in communication and kept in the loop if there's any additional funding that has been provided. Shown here is an example of how DOB is calculated. Again, pretty simple and tried to do it as straightforward as possible. But the total need of the program, the total need I should say is 5,000. All potential assistance equates to $100. Assistance determined to be a duplication of benefits is 50. And so, as you can see, if there's a cap on the program, reducing the award, the total award amount would be roughly $4,950. So that's just a very simple, straightforward example. They can certainly be more complicated than that. That's where we would encourage any outreach to DED for assistance. So now we're moving into the actual programs themselves for the economic development and emergent threat programs. DOB checks are first conducted by the subrecipient. So that would be noted in the policies and procedures that you'll see further down the slide deck. And then suitable documentation will vary by the source. The key is documenting the dollar amount and the purpose and or use of the funds. Documentation may include, but it's not limited to, award letters from federal agencies, funding commitment letters, government loans, and DOB source documentation is added to the program or project file and retained in accordance with the CV record retention requirements. If multiple users are identified, it is helpful to have a budget line item. So if there are multiple uses, have been identified, multiple funding sources, we would encourage, for the purposes of clearly understanding where the funding sources are coming, where the funding is coming from, to have a budget line item breakdown of the different funding amounts and their uses. And you may see that on some of the DOB documentation that DED has already provided for the programs. And yes, the presentation, and Mackenzie, correct me if I'm wrong, just saw a question come through. The presentation will be posted on the DED's website.
Yes, we'll plan to make it available following the presentation along with the recording.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. And then we proceed into the overview of specifically the procedures for DOB verification for each of the programs. So it might be slightly difficult to see, but again, it'll be on the website for future reference. The overview here, the process flow here outlines the duplication of benefits for the economic development program. And so it gives a good idea. I'm not going to read through all of them, but it certainly gives an idea of what the grantee and that's DED in this case, the responsibility on their end, of course, the subrecipient and the beneficiary. And I think for the purposes of the subrecipient section, I will go through those bullet points. Any memorandums of understanding, MOUs, with not-for-profits and local governments are encouraged, certainly, if that is how the structure of the project is being set up, and that should include any reference or note to DOB and who will be conducting that DOB review and ultimately responsible for the review and the submission of those documents up to the state. So the subrecipient, of course, conducts the document intake for existing businesses, for new or existing businesses, seeking financial support for job creation activities, job loss, and any medical supplies. The subrecipient will conduct the DOB review and forwards all supporting documentation to the grantee, and again, the grantee in this case is DED. And then all eligible applicants will need to provide self-certification forms and documentation outlining all sources of current and potential project funding. And then noted here for the beneficiary, which is also important, is that any low to moderate income individuals ready and available for work, and beneficiaries should also note any businesses or vendors that will be a direct recipient of the dollars and benefit of the dollars. So for the economic development DOB verification procedure, DOB source documentation is added to the program or project file as noted in the previous process flow, and that the economic development program is required to verify all duplication of benefits in support of the new businesses, business expansion to create jobs, manufacture medical supplies, etc. So this again just highlights the importance to have the subrecipient working with the beneficiaries to identify any duplication of benefits and document any retention for LMI persons as well. And next is the Emergent Threat Program under the under the CV program that DED has offered. And again, here's the process flow that's been built out for the program. Just noting here, the subrecipients and non-for-profits, they can, subrecipients can be either a local government or a non-for-profit or for-profit. So you'll see similarly the requirements across the board for the check is the same as noted in the previous process flow. So I won't go through those bullets again for you all. And then just to quickly highlight for the DOB verification procedures for the Emergent Threat Program, it is required to verify again all DOB payments for public facilities and public services projects that have gone to that will help to prevent, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. Subrecipients of DED are responsible for verifying all potential beneficiary DOB, and DED will then confirm that and verify if there aren't any duplication of benefits. And again, just to stress that the beneficiaries are responsible for submitting any documentation that speaks to dollars that they've received that overlap or that are the same scope of work that is under the CV grant. And just again to note, for these particular programs, DED has prepared three documents to help facilitate at the subrecipient level gathering the information as it relates to if there are any duplication of benefits or if there are any other funds received for each of the programs by the beneficiaries. So there we did DED did produce and share with the programs the duplication of benefits affidavit, the duplication of benefits certification, and for the certification that document, you may see and be asked to list out the funding sources, or excuse me, funding from multiple sources. So it gives a good list of potential funding sources that would benefit or overlap with the CV funding. And then last is the subrogation agreement that DED also provided for the programs. And then unfortunately, this is something that we definitely don't want to have to do, but it has to be included in the state's procedures, policies and procedures, along with the subrecipient. But if duplication of funding has been identified, we will have to go through a recapture process. So if it is discovered by the subrecipient must report that immediately to DED. DED and the subrecipient will collectively review the duplication of benefits and conduct an updated review and calculation. The subrecipient will be asked to provide their documentation, any additional documentation they've received from the beneficiary for DED's final review and decision. DED will perform a full reconciliation of the files and document the amount in a repayment letter. This will, of course, be in communication with the subrecipient. However, if the subrecipient and beneficiary disagree with the amount owed or the basis for which the repayment has been calculated, they can submit a written appeal to DED. So part of DED's, again, this highlights how DED will interact with the subrecipient when it comes to potential recapturing funding. But it's critical to note that as you all build out policies and procedures as it relates to the DOB piece, that the section regarding recapture, we did provide some guidance, but to certainly take a look and review and whether or not, if your legal counsel, if you have legal counsel for review of that piece, certainly encourage that. But again, this is pretty standard and pretty and outlined within the subrecipient agreements. That ends our sort of first half of the presentation. Again, just going over DOB and why it's required and how it applies to each of the programs. And I'm going to stop there and see if we have any questions that we can walk through, and then we'll hand it over to Allison to walk through the subrecipient policy and procedure template that the DED will be asking you all to submit. Allison, do we see any questions that came through other than if the presentation will be?
No questions in the chat right now, but if anyone also would like to unmute, please feel free to do so. Oh, actually, we did just get a question, and it is, if the subrogation agreement and the DOB affidavits and certifications were submitted as part of special conditions, is a community nonprofit subrecipient required to resubmit at this time?
Thanks for reading that, Allison, and thanks for the question, Lori. With respect to that, the duplication of benefits was first introduced to subrecipients at the special conditions side of things, and you're absolutely right, completed the forms that Laura went through earlier. The intent of where we are right now, what were the expectations for subrecipients right now, is to put together policies and procedures to ensure that they are avoiding duplication of benefits. So we'll be looking at that template here shortly. Throughout the life of the project, we do realize that there might be funding sources that come in later that maybe weren't captured as part of the initial, at the point in time when that information was collected at the time of special conditions. And we want to make sure that we're properly capturing any subsequent funds that come in. But for purposes of what we're looking at for this presentation and what we're looking at for expectations with respect to subrecipients is completion of the template, not necessarily of those forms unless there is additional funds to report. But Laura, I want to open it up to you if there's anything that I missed there.
No, well said, Mackenzie. At this point in the process, it is just getting the policies and procedures down on paper. And I, you know, as we get through the programs and the projects themselves, I would not be, the group should not be surprised that at the end of the project itself and potentially during the closeout, there may be requests for a DOB review at that time, but again, not at this moment, and not resubmitting any of those documents at this moment.
Great. No other questions right now. Again, please feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute if you'd rather ask any questions. Or you can continue to put them in the chat and we can move forward and we'll have another period for questions at the end.
Great. Allison, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk through the DOB template portion.
Great. So now we will go over the template that was emailed to all the subrecipients a couple weeks ago, and just what that process looks like and how you can either fill out the template or utilize your own DOB policies and procedures and share those with DED. So on the next slide, we have just an overview of the policies and procedures. The subrecipients, you all have completed initial DOB forms as part of your special conditions, as was mentioned, for the subrecipient agreements with DED. And DED does also require that subrecipients develop and maintain adequate written policies and procedures in order to prevent a duplication of benefits. And these are outlined in the SRA. So there are two requirements. The first is that any person or entity receiving the CV funds, including subrecipients or direct beneficiaries, must agree to repay the assistance that is determined to be duplicative. And then the second is that DED is requiring a method of assessing and documenting whether the use of the CV funds will duplicate financial assistance that is already received or is likely to be received by acting reasonably to evaluate the need and the resources available to meet that need. So again, these are outlined in the subrecipient agreements, and these are the minimum requirements as it relates to DOB. So now to move towards the template that we have discussed and DED has emailed a couple weeks back. You may utilize any existing DOB policies and procedures if your entity does have them, or you can utilize the template provided by DED as an outline to create a policy and procedure guide for your jurisdiction or the nonprofit. So the template that was provided by DED, which we'll pull up and we'll go over, does have instructions within every section in red to help assist you in the development of the P&P guide. And you can basically go through that document section by section, remove any of the red text instructions, and you can choose to accept the language that DED has already put in there for your use internally, or you can add to or insert your own procedures and have DED review those. So again, this template includes a lot of information and best practices, some diagrams and tables that and definitions that are helpful. but you can add any additional details on your entity's processes, and at a minimum, it has to meet the requirements that are set forth in the SRA. So now we'll pause the presentation and we'll switch over to the document itself, and we'll do a quick walkthrough of that. And again, please feel free to raise your hand or to type any questions in the chat as we go through this template. Great, thank you, Laura. So again, we'll just briefly go through these steps. Every section has directions that you can use and then remove. But just to start at the top, we have first we have a set of definitions. We suggest keeping these in. We believe it would be helpful for employees at your entity to just kind of have this background information about the program, about duplication of benefits, and have these definitions in one place. However, these definitions are in NDED's policies and procedures as well, and those are available online. So you may keep this section or remove it entirely. You may also choose to add in any definitions relating to your internal procedures. And so the next section is the introduction, which again, the same way with the definitions, you may choose to include these definitions of duplication of benefits and the requirements under the CARES Act and the roles and responsibilities for the program. You may also choose to remove this. However, we do believe it is helpful background information to provide your entity with kind of an overview of the program and of the requirements. And then the next sections that talk about the Economic Development Program and the Emergent Threat Program. Again, you may choose to keep this language in and just insert your subrecipient name. You may choose to add to it. If you are only implementing one of the programs, you can delete sections for the other program entirely. And if you are implementing both programs, you can submit just one document. Please make sure to cover both programs within that document. So the next section is the duplication of benefits calculation. And this was the example that Laura went through on the PowerPoint. And again, this could be removed, but it is useful to just have a very simple example within your policies and procedures. And the next is the DOB documentation and verification. And this is really the bulk of the PNP guide, where you will be inserting your steps for each of the programs or for whichever program you are implementing. So what we have here is 7 basic steps. They are the same for the 2 programs. And again, you can remove if you're not implementing a certain program. You may choose to add to these steps, whether you would like for it to be more detailed for your local processes within your agency, or you may choose to accept these more general steps that DED has outlined here. And again, these steps are also outlined, at least on DED's end, and they are available online. So these steps are very similar to DED's process, but this document is really tailored towards your role as a subrecipient. So you may add in more steps, or you may keep this as is. The next section is the potential sources. And again, you can include this information to point whoever is in your entity is working on duplication of benefits and these programs to have more information about background on potential sources. And this table 2 just highlights some of these potential sources. So this could be removed, but it is helpful to keep here as kind of an overview. And then the next, which Laura's already mentioned, is the 3 required forms for both programs. So we do believe it is helpful to just keep this list in here and ensure you have these templates on file for each of these 3 templates and forms to go along with this policy and procedure document. And then the final section is just on recapturing duplicative assistance, which Laura mentioned during the PowerPoint slides. So in here, we do suggest that subrecipients maintain explicit recapture policies and procedures in order to resolve any duplication of benefits issues that come up. So this is kind of the basic steps and procedures. And again, you can kind of accept this as is, or please add any more details. But again, the minimum requirements are those 2 that are set forth in the SRA. So now we'll pause, and if there are any questions specifically about this template, please drop them in the chat. Okay, so now we'll go back to the presentation if there are no questions. And again, we'll leave some time for questions at the end. I did see one question actually just come in, and it's, does the municipality and the nonprofit have to adopt this?
That's a great question. Pursuant to the subrecipient agreement that DED has signed with respect to, and then any MOU with a nonprofit or a for-profit, the way it's set up there, that only the subrecipient municipality would have to submit one of these policies and procedures documents. So that's all that's our expectation as requirement for the municipality to complete and submit this documentation. Laura, unless you'd advise otherwise, if the nonprofit would like to leverage the template to set up any procedures on their end, they're more than welcome to there. But for purposes of submission to the department and the minimum requirements set forth in the subrecipient agreement, the submission only needs to be from the subrecipient municipality.
Yeah, Mackenzie, exactly. The entity that's directly receiving the CV funding to administer is the responsible entity for the policy and procedure. Certainly, we certainly don't discourage, but we'll encourage any of the not-for-profits or partners with the subrecipients to review the DOB policies and procedures with the subrecipient, make sure that the not-for-profit, if they are collecting documentation or assisting the beneficiaries in the programs, that they be aware of the policies and procedures on the DOB end. So that minimum, that's certainly what I would suggest for the not-for-profits that are assisting the subrecipients.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for pulling up kind of the submission and review slide. Emails about the PNP template went out about 10 days ago or so ago, excuse me. And we're asking that they be returned to the department no later than 45 days from that email. I believe they went out on a couple different days, so I don't have a date in here specifically, but it's roughly about the first week in August. But just keep in communication with us, and so we can get that submitted so DED can review and ensure that it meets those minimum requirements in the subrecipient agreement. And again, that relates to a requirement that any person or entity receiving CV funds must agree to repay assistance that is determined to be duplicative, and that there's a method of assessing and documenting whether CV funds will duplicate financial assistance that's already been received or likely to be received. So those are our minimum requirements that we're looking at there. When you're putting together that P&P, the document submitted should clearly reference the jurisdiction's name, the entity's name, for purposes if there's a local procedure for putting policies and procedures on letterhead or on stationery, wanting to ensure that it's clearly associated with the local jurisdiction. If your entity is implementing projects under both programs, as Allison mentioned, you're welcome to submit a single document to cover the process for both programs. As Allison also mentioned, if there's policies and procedures already in place that cover this and you would like to submit the existing policies and procedures, you're welcome to do that as well via the DED.CDBG-CV joint inbox. And again, DED will then take a look at the items submitted to ensure that it meets those minimum requirements, or request any additional information if we have questions. The intent of the template was to really provide a framework of how to meet those minimum requirements. And as Allison mentioned, to drop in if there's special things that are being done at the local level that need to be reflected in there, just to make sure it adequately captures the local process is what we're going for here. And then this will be available, as we mentioned about the slide deck and the recording, a list of the CDBG CV resources, a link to DED's policies and procedures. If you take a look at those, you'll notice they're very similar to the template that we went through, as well as the Federal Register notice and other resources from HUD about the CV program. Specifically, it'll walk through to some of the duplication of benefits requirements that were presented here today as well.
Yeah, Mackenzie, I just wanted to note here on the HUD Exchange website, there is a particular section that HUD has called out for CV, for duplication benefits under CV. So we would certainly encourage the subrecipients through the HUD Exchange program link that you'll see on the third bullet down, second bullet in, to highly encourage you all to take a look and review the DOB language that HUD has put together as it relates directly to the CV funding. It's just it is for HUD to provide standalone language and guidance for a particular funding source for DOB. I think it's just important for the larger group to note that and to take a moment to go through those, go through that section of the website. So this does conclude the presentation for today as it relates to DOB and the template. For those that, again, this will be, this has been recorded and will be posted on the DED website. And for those that have any questions, feel free to enter through the chat box. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to submit them to the DED email address for CV that you'll see on the screen here. But certainly open to answering any questions that you all may have now. Mackenzie, did you want to add anything on your end?
No, thank you so much, Laura, for buttoning that up and dropping the contact information on the screen. We're happy to help over the next little bit less than 45 days or so to put these templates together and answer any questions that you may have. So please let us know what we can do. I don't see any more questions coming in. And as Laura said, that was the end of our formal presentation. So feel free to drop off. We'll hang on here for another minute or so just to see if anything else pops up. But thank you guys so much for sticking with us today and talking through everything.